Mad Munchkin Reaction Theatre. Fantastic Mr. Fox. What can I say about this film? Well, quite a lot, as it turns out. Fantastic Mr. Fox is a movie that is not all that bothered or obsessed with detail. Just like Isle of Dogs, another film I need to make a video on, this film is highly centralized and has subjective control. It's a tightly wound film with robotic precision, but it also has a very handmade feel. Like most stop-motion films, there is a fragility here, a delicate feel that makes the characters themselves feel a little listless at times, resulting in them feeling weightless. If anything, I am very aware of the stop-motion through the entire runtime, probably because of how this film is staged and shot. Is this a bad thing? Well, the suspension of disbelief is broken when we are very aware of the animation. After all, when watching an animated movie, we're not supposed to be left in awe wondering how they did something. In fact, ironically, we're not supposed to even notice at all, but instead get wrapped up in the story. I never really had a moment I felt immersed in the story with this one. But the appeal of stop motion is that almost everything we see on screen is tangible and real, so sometimes to me they're not as immersive as other animated films are. That's not to say that this is a bad thing. It conveys a feeling that no other medium is able to do, and that, to me, will always be special. But does Fantastic Mr. Fox live up to its name? Well, the visuals themselves may not exactly be extravagant or fanciful, as the name implies, but it still manages to be absurd and nonsensical without being too whimsical. It has an earthly tone, as it should, with most of the film being set either underground or in a tree. What really makes this film fantastic is how simple it is. The film feels like a diorama, as do most stop-motion films, but the main thing this film is above anything else is minimalistic. In fact, if anything, it's a perfect example of a less is more movie. Animated movies are often flooded with detail, made far too complex in the visuals, so that the characters end up feeling bland and uninteresting in comparison. So when taking a minimalistic approach to filmmaking, brevity in communication is more effective than verbosity. The focus is placed on the important things and everything else is removed altogether. When adapting stories into film, sometimes some of their charm is difficult to translate, especially when the story is so stereotypically British, like most Roald Dahl stories are. But with making this story into stop motion, the charm shifts from the story itself to the visuals. Roald Dahl stories are already so simple and yet also fantastical. They seem tailor-made for stop motion. Though stories about anthropomorphic animals have been done to death in animation, and are of course nothing new in stop motion either, there's something to be said about such a simple story being told in one of the most artistically complex art mediums ever invented, and also one of the oldest. Though Wes Anderson's style does translate well into this story, the term style over substance comes to mind. I hate using this term, but there is a homespun aesthetic to this film. Its offbeat dialogue and awkward silences make the film feel very unique when compared to other films released the same year. A perfect film to compare to would be Coraline, a stop-motion film directed by Henry Selick. Unlike Fantastic Mr. Fox, Coraline takes full advantage of CGI and green screen, whereas Fantastic Mr. Fox does almost everything by hand, including the water, fire, and smoke effects. But Coraline has a more offbeat feel to it and also has the advantage of the story being far more fantastical than Fantastic Mr. Fox. How ironic. Its deadpan humour and almost rhythmic dialogue delivery keeps the film as balanced as its symmetrical cinematography. It has a very sincere and authentic tone as a result. Fantastic Mr. Fox is a children's story written by Roald Dahl in 1970. Many changes were made for this movie, focusing more on Mr. Fox and his relationship with his wife and son, padding out the story more while also removing unneeded elements. In most of Roald Dahl's stories, the conflict lies between the relationships between adults and children. The child characters usually act like adults, while the adults act like children. Mr. Fox gives up a life of crime for the sake of his family, but then goes back to it when his son is 12 years old. His nephew acts more mature than any other character in the film, a hyper-achieving individual, while Mr. Fox himself is the stereotypical man-child, or fox, man, child, struggling to achieve anything. He's a character that becomes unglued and goes back to his old thieving ways, even after promising his wife he would never go back to them. This isn't portrayed as a bad thing. In fact, it's something that the film embraces, as the farmers Mr. Fox steals from, Bogus Bunsen Bean, represent consumption, artificiality, and ignorance. In a way, the film is a commentary on how society is obsessed with materialism and profiteering. Or maybe I'm just reading too much into these things again. Maybe it is simply a story about a fox breaking into a chicken coop on a farm to feed his family. Yeah, that's it. And it's fantastic. I'm Mad Munchkin. Stay creative.